I'd like to pay my respects to the countless animals who have come since, many who have found themselves in a landscape and climate not intended for them, who have been deemed friend, foe or commodity based on what humans decided we can gain from them. And when it comes to the amount of suffering and the sheer numbers involved, no species suffered more than those who are commodified for us to eat and wear. A tiny representation of just some of those species are the 15 individuals we honour here today. My name is Kristen. I'm deeply grateful to you for turning up today to speak up for the animals and to call out this government for its immoral and unjustifiable action. Today we stand united outside the Victorian Parliament, honouring 13 individuals who represent the millions of victims this Parliament voted almost unanimously to push further into the darkness by silencing those who expose the grim realities of their lives and deaths. Ag-Gag laws specifically targeted at activists and whistleblowers who expose the atrocities that occur in animal agriculture industries. On this day, July 1st, 2022, Ag-Gag commenced in the state of Victoria. During the 2019 parliamentary inquiry into the impact of animal rights activists on Victorian agriculture, the majority of submissions made were in support of activist rights to expose animal abuse and against increased legislation. Of the submissions which were in favour of tougher penalties for activists, the majority were, of course, animal agriculture businesses and individuals who were identified as having a strong association with the animal agriculture industry. There was not a single finding in that inquiry that an animal rights activist had ever engaged in any kind of violent or physical altercation, nor was there any evidence or even mention that an activist had ever caused a biosecurity event. Yet, the recommendations to come from the inquiry by the committee called for laws to specifically target animal rights activists under the guise of biosecurity concerns, through the implementation of both on-the-spot fines and additional extraordinary penalties for trespassing on animal agriculture facilities. At the time, Sonia Terpstra, one of 3 Labor MPs on the committee, submitted a scathing minority report to the committee recommendations. To finding 5, that animal rights activists who trespass on agricultural facilities pose a biosecurity risk, Sonia Terpstra stated, "Disagree. There is no evidence to support this conclusion." She went on to highlight the sufficient penalties for trespass already exist. Quote, "Given the low incidence of offences recorded by authorities, there is no evidence that would justify an increase in fines, penalties or sentences in the areas of trespass, theft or biosecurity, as they are adequate." In response to finding 6, that acts of trespass on agricultural facilities by animal rights activists are a risk to the health and safety of farmers, agricultural employees, so-called livestock, emergency services, the public and activists themselves, the Labor MP stated in her report, "No evidence of this." Even Agriculture Victoria confirmed in the inquiry that there had been no biosecurity incidents caused by animal rights activists, and Superintendent Graney from Victoria Police advised the committee that in his view, current legislation in this area is adequate. Ms Terpstra went further to also list the many gross inadequacies and missed opportunities by the inquiry committee. Most notably, there was a lack of ability to receive information and/or exploration of how farmers could potentially use science, technology and innovation to reduce unnecessary production of animals to produce food, and a lack of consideration around mental health support for farmers and abattoir workers. As an industry, abattoir workers have high rates of PTSD, PITS and other associated disorders and behaviours arising from having to kill animals. Yet, Labor went ahead and accepted these recommendations of increased penalties targeted specifically at activists, and when they were put forward to the Parliament, every single member of the Labor Party in both the lower and the upper house voted in support of the discriminatory penalties, including Ms Terpstra. That's politics, right? Particularly in the Labor Party. Voting for what you believe is right or against what you believe is wrong will likely cost you your job. And what is that worth when you may not have the numbers to make a difference to the vote anyway? Your dignity, perhaps? The Labor amendments were of course supported by all Liberals, all Nationals and most independents and minor parties. 121 of the 128 members of this Parliament voted to further protect animal abuse. In the process, we were forced to suffer hours of painful spin from just about everywhere about how much farmers love their animals, that abuse and suffering is rare, and that it is, in fact, the activists who threaten the well-being and safety of the animals. Former Labor Minister for Agriculture, Marianne Thomas, who introduced the legislation, said animal activists put hard-working farming families, biosecurity and the animals they purport to protect at risk. I'm sorry, are these people even hearing themselves? Is anyone buying this rubbish? Please tell me it's not only vegans who realise what absolute lunacy this is. At what point are we going to become mature and honest enough as a nation to acknowledge that the suffering is inherent and systemic, and that true caring does not involve the violent, bloody exploitation, abuse and killing of others? It was like listening to some bizarre satire playing out inside the halls occupied by the people this state actually voted for. What a sad, sad state of affairs. In 2014, I stood on these very steps with activists from other movements, mostly the trade unions, as we protested against the then Liberal state government Premier Dennis Napthine's Summary Offences Amendment Bill, best known as the Silencing Act or Anti-Protest Law. Some wore tape on their mouths, just like we are here today. It passed and gave police the power to move on, fine and arrest people they believed to be causing or likely to cause obstructed access to buildings or impeding the movement of people or traffic, or people they anticipate may become violent. Additionally, courts could issue exclusion orders, bans on being in a designated public space for up to 12 months. Breaching a penalty order could result in 2 years imprisonment. The new law was thrown out by the new Andrews Labor government, who came into power not long after. Notably, in opposition to the anti-protest law, then National Vice President of the Labor Party, Jane Garrett, said, quote, "It's a slippery slope for government to go down when they restrict people's right to protest. The right to be heard is hard-won and cherished, and we're deeply concerned about conservative government policies that make it difficult for people to speak, particularly those who already have limited power or influence in our community," end quote. In 2015, I again stood on these steps, protesting proposed legislation against activists. This time, it was alongside my direct comrades. It was Ag-Gag. It had made its way to our shores after gaining momentum in the US and was first proposed by Chris Back, Liberal member in the Australian Senate at the time. He had the nerve to propose the bill was to better protect animals, just as they have done here today. If passed, it would require anyone with any recordings of animals being subjected to malicious cruelty to report this within 1 business day to police or face extraordinary fines. Increased penalties for causing economic damage to a business if it happened to be an animal enterprise, and a sliding scale reaching life imprisonment for damaging property belonging to a person connected to an animal enterprise was also included. There was nothing in the bill about penalties for anyone who actually subjected the animals to the malicious cruelty or witnessed the cruelty directly themselves. The bill was clearly directed at activists and whistleblowers, building thorough investigations to demonstrate that animal abuse and suffering in agriculture is systemic and inherent by releasing documented evidence captured over a period of time. Senator Back resigned before the bill passed, so it lies dormant somewhere in the Australian capital. But 2 years later, New South Wales passed its own first ever Ag-Gag legislation, and the federal government, Queensland and now Victoria have followed suit with various and insidious forms. Queensland and New South Wales have more recently also passed outrageous draconian anti-protest laws directed not only at animal rights activists, but also at those taking action for the climate crisis. In New South Wales, they very much resemble those passed by the Napthine government in 2014. The simple act of protest on roads in New South Wales without permission from government now makes you a criminal. Victoria is following suit with recent legislation put forward to target anti-logging protesters who are working to end the annihilation of Victoria's old-growth forests, much of which has been illegal logging by Vic Forests, a Victorian government agency. Tasmania is now facing similar corruption. Labor, Liberal, such repressive laws have been introduced and supported across the country by both parties. I must say it did surprise me that Vic Labor brought forward this legislation, or should I say it may have once upon a time, but not so much now. What happened to the party who threw out the Silencing Act of the Napthine government? Who was that, or was that simply because it targeted unions? But when it comes to those who are trying to protect animals from unimaginable horrors and the planet from absolute destruction, the tables so easily turn. The hypocrisy is astounding. Victorian Labor, the party so many still seem to refer as progressive, even left by some. When it comes to animals, both free living and farmed, and the environment, I have to say, it's often hard to know who's worse. And using biosecurity concerns to justify this, that has to be the real kicker. The last place I walked into, a bunch of rats scurried away into the darkness as our lights hit the entrance of the dingy shed. Thousands of birds stuck cramped inside tiny cages, sometimes 5 to each cage, as far as the eye could see. Many were literally standing on top of the rotting corpses of their deceased friends who had succumbed to disease or some other horrid illness just days or even weeks earlier. Their death, you'd think, would no doubt be a welcome relief to a miserable 18 months they would have had otherwise spent enduring what could only be described as sheer torture. But still, for most, death is not welcome. They fight, they struggle, they scream and they beg. I've seen enough horror in enough individuals' eyes to know that they are asking why. Why are you doing this to me? The individuals who are rescued, often on the precipice of death, demonstrate the most inspiring will to live, often overcoming the most challenging obstacles. Their self-determination, once given an opportunity for agency, is a powerful thing to witness, and no doubt inspires many of us to go on. The biosecurity management plans associated with this legislation are voluntary, and no recommendations were made by the inquiry committee to move away from animal agriculture, despite clear evidence provided in countless submissions of all its harms, not just to the animals but to humans and the planet we depend on to survive. Not even a global pandemic which shut down this city for months on end was enough to wake them up. Experts agree that exploiting animals through farming them, clearing the land for free-living species that they use for that farming, the wildlife trade and the consumption of so-called bushmeat is what's predominantly driving infectious diseases. And these factories they call farms are a petri dish for the mutation and spread. But still, there's nobody home at Parliament on this issue aside from a tiny few, or perhaps just one. Instead, they use the pandemic to further incriminate, shame and incite hatred onto the activists who are trying to bring the industry that is the leading cause of pandemics to an end. Meanwhile, a war is being waged on this country's first animals who are already desperately struggling to survive due to the climate crisis and endless land clearing for animal agriculture and urban sprawl. This year, the Andrews government kangaroo kill quota for Victoria alone was just under 186,000 individuals, of which 128 could be harvested for bushmeat, sneakers and all other vile things their bodies are used for. Yes, bushmeat, just another infectious disease waiting to happen, coming from the flesh of the Aussie icon and the sacred totem animal for many First Nations people. They are the creator spirit and the dreaming of country, whose land now becomes a killing field under the cover of night. Excuse my language, but what the actual fuck are these people doing? How can they be so stupid, so morally deprived, and so dead inside to the suffering of others? Imagine having the power to cast a vote in Parliament that can determine legislation. What an absolute privilege. Then imagine using that vote to cause further harm and suffering instead of supporting kindness, justice, and peace. I heard someone say recently, what have we done? In her 2018 paper titled Ag-Gag Laws in Australia, Activists Under Fire May Not Be Out of the Woods Yet, Elizabeth Engels-Oz concluded, Australia's proposed Ag-Gag laws provide an unnecessary criminal sanction which disproportionately affects activists and whistleblowers, and it has a chilling effect on the free political communication regarding animal welfare concerns. Prevention of legitimate public discourse and debate over food production and the treatment of animals during the food production process may also undermine the democratic process. End quote. So again, we stand united today outside the Victorian Parliament, honouring 13 individuals who represent the millions of victims this Parliament voted almost unanimously to push further into the darkness by silencing those who expose the grim realities of their lives and deaths. If you will continue to turn a blind eye to them, we must bring them to you. And we will continue to do so no matter what you throw our way, whether that be their bodies or the documented evidence of the abuse they endure, their forced insemination, their selective breeding causing painful deformities, the separation of babies from their grief-stricken mothers who bellow for days, their mutilations, torture, terror, their neglect, their incarceration, and their eventual slaughter. We will continue to document it and share it with the world. And along the way, we will keep trying to find the time, the money, the energy, and the space to rescue as many as we can. To scoop up their broken bodies, heal their wounds, wash away their feces-coated feathers, fur and wool, support them as they rebuild their strength and learn how to live the lives they always deserved with agency and dignity. While that may be criminal according to your pathetic laws, it is you who will be remembered for further protecting the most vile and the most heinous and brutal abuse imaginable of the most vulnerable and innocent. If you watched the live feed this morning, you would have seen how we called out the lies told during the debate by all sides, that farmed animals are protected from suffering and that there are agencies that exist to ensure this. Well, we all know that's a lie, and this morning we proved so yet again. The video we released shows standard suffering that occurs everywhere across this state, and there is no one there to stop it. No one came running when we called to protect those animals and to charge those responsible, because the abuse is protected by law, and the agencies apparently tasked with protecting those animals are a combination of powerless, indifferent and compromised. Let this be a reminder that we are all they have. The sanctuaries, the rescuers, the investigators and the advocates. We are all they have, and we will not be silenced by the heartless indoctrination this government are yet to overcome. An indoctrination so deeply entrenched in society that most don't even see it. Supporting atrocities that go against the core values of most. Blinded by behaviour we'd never willingly choose if we were given an educated choice before it became normalised habit. The people I know don't often spend their time doing what they should be, enjoying their lives, sharing them with loved ones. No, they spend their time off, their holidays, their weekends, even their weeknights, traipsing through shit, inhaling toxic fumes, witnessing the most callous, the most heinous and the most morally deprived treatment of sometimes tens of thousands of individuals in just one night. using their own hard-earned funds to cover vet bills in attempts to heal the bodies of the broken, that are broken in every way you could think of, risking their lives, their freedom and their sanity, saving some where they can, leaving just about all behind. Waking guilt-ridden that you didn't do enough, that you should have saved more. The face of one individual from the night before, who you left behind, burned into your memory. But it is these very actions, the rescues, the occupations, the documenting and the sharing of their stories and their suffering that has caused governments to fight back. They represent a system that protects industry over ethics, profits over kindness, and power over justice. And for the first time in the history of the animal rights movement, of this country at least, we have challenged that. We built the foundations of an army that for the first time turned the mainstream conversation from one of welfare to should we be using animals at all? Ag-Gag and anti-protest laws are the sign that that is working. It was working. That we were breaking through. Repression only comes from fear of change, the fear of losing power and control. And the stronger we get, the harder they will push back. Our foundations were all but torn down by COVID and its accompanying stresses that caused divides fed by intolerance and self-righteousness from all sides. Now it's time to rebuild with a stronger foundation that encourages and supports each other, that works together, that embraces diversity and encourages greater inclusion, that celebrates our wins and learns from our losses. Let Ag-Gag be the beginnings of the fight that was always going to happen, that has to happen, before we can start to see the cracks showing into a world where all beings are respected and valued in their own right for who they are, not what they can provide. Finally, I'm so sorry to the animals who we hold here today. Your bodies have been used to represent the millions of your kind, and you weren't given a choice in that. But you are in the arms of your angels who spend every single day dedicated to ending this nightmare so that those to come do not suffer as you did. May you each rest peacefully and know we are so sorry and we are trying. Thank you.